every politician is now visiting the ghetto for validation and legitimacy.
You can't piss off the government in order to stay successful in one way or the other. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Bad Natives podcast. I am Adeswagi Sage out of Lagos, Nigeria.
And I am Robert Kabushenga, the bad native from Kampala.
I'm Charles Onyango Bo in Nairobi, Kenya.
Fantastic. Everyone, remember to like, share, subscribe. If you like this type of content about Africa, the world, and Africans telling African stories, we are going to start today on a good note. We are starting today on a very positive note because Ethiopia has completed and inaugurated their dam project, which their president has described as the greatest thing that a black man has done. So I wanted to start with Charles. What are the implications of this dam trying to take 60% of Ethiopia's population, the second most populous country in Africa, out of the dark?
Well, I think, he can be forgiven for exaggeration. It's not, it's probably not the greatest achievement by a,
Yes.
by a black person, but it's a remarkable feat, and several aspects of it. So first of all, they raised a significant money, almost 79-80% of the money locally, through infrastructure bonds, and they they go to uh, the people to buy small bits and pieces. So they had thousands of people who did that, and so to imagine it cost slightly over 5 billion and they raised local. I think that is impressive. So and he's correct to brag. It's Africa's largest hydropower dam, and it is the 15th globally for power generation. And but it raises the question: what does it? Will it inspire? Kind of a movement in that direction? Are we going to see the political leaderships engaging with the people, with people like Bob who have money to to buy to put in infrastructure? If they did, it would really be a wonderful change, of direction.
I think, Charles, I want to come in right there. And, because I think the greatest credit goes to someone we've all now forgotten. Perhaps one of the most brilliant minds in Africa's politics, a man called Meles Zenawi. Meles, who was Prime Minister of Ethiopia when this project was actually conceptualized, and the idea of having to finance it the way they financed it, the credit must go to Meles Zenawi, because Meles had this oversized ambition for the regeneration of Ethiopia's glory. And and for him, I remember him making a statement once. He said, "We lost 500 years of our civilization. We must catch up very quickly. We have to do things that get our people into the modern world." And so you've got to credit him with, for instance, the construction of the railway. And then you have to give this to him because he's the one who came up with the vision. He's the one who conceptualized how it is to be done. But it is also greater credit to the Ethiopian establishment that they were able to see it through, even when the person who led it. And I would, and Charles and Adesua, I think to understand what they just did, we need to look at Ethiopian Airlines. It's the only airline that is flying on the African continent uninterrupted since 1936. So we must acknowledge something about the Ethiopian self-belief, that they always go back to the Battle of Adwa. And what was on display when they launched their dam was an outflow, an outpouring of patriotism, of pride, of national pride. People were in tears, including Abiy himself, the prime minister. He was crying. But I think for me, the biggest achievement was when they stood up to the bullying of international powers that were trying to support Egypt's objections to this development. And I think by doing that, they've redefined how the water resources of the Nile, or the riparian area as it's called, can be used for the development. Because they've been making the argument that we can't go back to what Egypt has always enjoyed and wanted. We must now take into account the development needs. And I think that's an argument that Museveni has been making. We must take into account the development needs of the countries that are along the Nile. Egypt can't behave as if they're the only ones entitled to use the Nile and that everyone else must be subordinated to them. Now, what's going to be very interesting is to see whether Egypt actually suffers as a result of this dam being operated. And if it doesn't, it will probably put them in an even much weaker position because they've made the point that you will have water, we will have development. But I think finally what's exposed is I think Egypt's more worried about a more powerful and hugely populous Ethiopia. And that once they have an infrastructure project like this, they will be difficult to contain in the geopolitics. My final point on this is actually the lesson to us as Africans. And again, on this, I want to tickle Adesiwa. You see, what the Ethiopians have just done is what I call the Dangote moment. You see, Dangote, whether Adesiwa likes it or not, has made Nigerians believe that you can actually construct a refinery of your own, so and refine fuel. The Ethiopians have now demonstrated that you can finance from within African resources an infrastructure project of this magnitude. I now feel like calling up the president of Uganda and asking him, why are you running around the world looking for money to set up a refinery in Uganda? Just give us a bond and just be sure that the money is actually used for that and not diverted to go and do funny things with the politics of Uganda. But I think what this shows, I think more than just the greatest thing that the black man has done, I think what Ethiopia has taught us is that Africans can actually now raise their own money and deliver development without needing the usual financing suspects. And in fact, it's a very bad example, and I think the Ethiopians might pay a very high price.
You know, that's actually a very great point, particularly the fact that this is an African project funded by Africans, and also what it means for Ethiopia's like power in the region. But again, I want us before we go to Egypt and their problems, because a lot of the pushback I've read some Egyptian analysts say they did this because we were going through the Arab Spring when they started and we were under chaos and they took advantage. But before we go to Egypt, I want us to stay with Ethiopia, particularly because of this idea of what the dam can do for them, especially in areas of electricity and industrial growth. The fact that part of why Africa is behind is the fact that we are electricity poor. And there is no country in the world that's electricity poor that is financially wealthy. So, in terms of taking Ethiopia out of the dark, as I like to call it, how important is this? The electrification of Ethiopia and 60% of its population that currently doesn't have proper access to electricity. But how important is this for Ethiopia? Let's park Egypt aside. We'll face them later. But when it comes to the importance,
Oh yeah, it is up. So like you said as well that no country has become wealthy or industrialized without resolving the energy question. Because if you look at the industrial revolution itself, the industrial revolution itself was ultimately a revolution of energy. First coal and later oil and then gas came. So, but if Ethiopia can just ride on this and take the figure I see is about 66 to 70 million people whose lives could change. Can you imagine if Ethiopia just added 35 million people into the middle class over the next 5, 10 years. That is huge, huge. And if you look down the road, by 2035, they'll have 260 million. And if with this power thing they are able to have at least half of them in the middle class, the knock-on effect in the region and on in Africa will be incredibly huge. So yes, it is important that this works, but the 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 other thing about this is that what actually this then does is it will create what I think is the bigger problem with the water. It will create this wealthy population just needs more water, and then more water means you have to pump in pipes in houses, but most of all, as Robert would tell you, agriculture. So the 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 in terms of the politics of water, I think that the concern, which probably is legitimate, is now what happens when we tap in it for agriculture. But the knock-on effect on this, I mean, just both internally, what it will do for, and the one of the things that happen is that it's and maybe it is probably negative. I think there is also a kind of a militarist triumphalist element that has come with this success, because now Abiy is again saying, okay, we need access to the sea. We have this giant uh, this big factory we are producing suicide drones, so you can actually see that this economic success, it seems, could produce, it is a kind of a form of militarism, which would be very ironical.
I see three things with this that play perfectly into Ethiopia's advantage. The first thing, believe it or not, is Trump's tariffs. And how does that work? You see, now a number of manufacturers are relocating from countries that have been hit with high tariffs. So if Ethiopia can provide unlimited access to energy and low costs of labor, which is what Ethiopia is very good at doing, they will become a manufacturing alternative and hub for launching into the Western markets, because now they provide an option. The only challenge there is access to the sea, but otherwise, it comes at a time when Ethiopia can now position and say, we've got a very highly educated and sophisticated population. They are skilled at manual labor, which they're good at. They've got an airline that is reliable and functions. They've got infrastructure in terms of the roads. Now they've solved the energy question. So you can come and actually just set up in Ethiopia, and then very quickly you will get moving. And they have a very well, by the way, I think they have even overtaken Kenya on the export of flowers. I know one thing for sure. They are the ones providing
Yeah.
transportation for Ugandan flower farmers. So they've already proved that on the export thing, they can do a good job. Now,
Hmm.
if they can, so they can now market. And I think, Charles, that whole thing about drones was not about military capacity. I think it was marketing to the other players that they've got capacity to do sophisticated manufacturing of electronics. So they become an industrial option on the African continent. Secondly, and this is the interesting thing, they can now become an alternative for the Chinese, because the Chinese are trying to exit a certain segment of manufacturing, and Ethiopia has a very good relationship with China. So the second thing is that as China tries to reorganize its manufacturing, there might be some logic in moving into Ethiopia. Now, the third thing is, i.e., number three, is Ethiopia has one thing money can't buy. So you see, for the rest of us here on the podcast, money can buy politics, but money cannot buy patriotism. It can't. And there was one thing that Ethiopians have. They may disagree politically and even be violent, but they are very, very patriotic. And when I say there was an outpouring of patriotism over this event, there are some accounts that I follow on social media from Ethiopia that post just professional stuff. You know, one of them is a pilot. The only thing he ever talks about is takeoffs and landing of planes. The guy posted the full reel of the launch of the dam, and he was so emotional about it. So, in a country of 90 million people who think like that, that is a powerful force. The only thing I wish they had done is I wish they had done this during the African Union meeting and invited all these African leaders and showed them what you can do with $5 billion. 5 billion. And they saw how much did Tinubu spend on 3 kilometers.
I mean, very pointed to bring that here because having a huge national debate right now about debt. And it's not just about, because there was a West African meeting for parliamentary meeting, and the Speaker of the House of Representatives in Nigeria spoke about our rising debt profile and said that our debt is now about the GDP to debt ratio is at 52%, but it should be barred. Legally, it should not pass 40%. Tinubu did borrow $1.5 billion for conditional cash transfers. They have allegedly shared $1.5 billion to 70 million Nigerians. I am yet to find someone who received that cash transfer, but you never know. They might be somewhere. But this is the issue, right? When we're talking about borrowing as African nations, because we're not the most indebted. I think Sudan. I think their debt to GDP ratio is even around maybe 200% or something extreme like that. But when we're talking about borrowing and as African nations, over 30%, around 36% of our debt is held by multilateral institutions like the World Bank and the IMF. Around 13% or so is held by China. When we're talking about debt and servicing our projects, one thing you said earlier that stuck out to me is that, if Museveni can show you that we borrowed this money and then we actually built this infrastructure, then we will not feel so bad about it. But if you're borrowing and borrowing and we don't see the outcome of this borrowing, that is when it becomes a problem. So, in terms of what this signals for African leaders, Charles, particularly when we're thinking about our debt profiles, our ex-presidents are currently going around asking for debt forgiveness, like Obasanjo and I believe even in South Africa, asking for debt forgiveness. However, when we think about fiscal responsibility on the continent, what do you think this sends a signal in terms of fiscal responsibility?
Well, you, unfortunately, and then you touch on it. If as a young journalist, I followed this whole issue in the 90s when it started of debt forgiveness. And at that time, it was so revolutionary. Uganda was one of the pioneers, in and around the philosophical issues around debt forgiveness. And United saw, all the shebang of African countries got debt, forgiveness. Literally, everyone who is asking for it a second time already had a run at it. So it's and my own sense is that it seems to have created a moral hazard that the political establishments are beginning to calculate that they can run up debt, and when it becomes unsustainable, they'll be bailed out or get forgiveness. So I am just hoping that debt forgiveness doesn't come back again.
Charles, I think the important point that Adesua is raising is what is now going to become an important political debate: fiscal responsibility, fiscal discipline. And I go back to what's happening in the world today. I mean, there is a complete reordering of the international order of things. Complete reordering. I mean, who would have envisaged Israel bombing literally every Arab country in their neighborhood simply to try and they're playing what's it called, whack-a-mole, trying to get Hamas
Mm.
leadership and remove it. Now, when those things happen, they interfere with the flow of resources. Now, I believe that what's likely to happen is that all countries are now going to spend money arming themselves, those who have it, because they want to protect their wealth. If you look at the destruction that Russia has unleashed on Ukraine, the Europeans will want to take. So it means that very likely in the next 2, 3 years, Africa is going to struggle to raise money. It therefore means that politically, the questions arise as to how is money being spent? The one that you have, how are you spending it? And I know this one thinks that I am too optimistic about the ability of the populations to do this. Look, it will become unavoidable. Either you
Mm.
do that, or we will end up with the issue you raised with us earlier on in the week when you talked about a sort of Arab Spring in Asian countries. I mean, you have seen the sickening pictures coming out of Nepal, where the population discovered that their political establishment has been living large and enjoying life. They've decided they've burnt the prime minister's wife in her house. They were kicking the finance minister in the streets. You can have an actual breakdown if you don't allow the discussion to happen around how is money being used. I mean, earlier on, I was talking to someone about what happened during the elections of our ruling party. And Charles, you're going to laugh when I tell you this. One of the delegates was called by a candidate and offered a certain amount of money. Then, before he could sleep, he got another phone call from the rival, that one, who asked him, how much did the other one give you? When the guy mentioned the amount, the guy doubled it immediately and he said, give me your number. Then the third guy in the race then calls and doubles the amount that the other two had paid this guy. And the guy who had spent a bit of his own money coming from a rural area to come for the delegates conference was suddenly so cash rich before he could even get the allowance from the ruling party for coming to the meeting. And he was saying, what the hell is going on? And it was more than 3 times what he was going to get as his allowance. Now, unfortunately, if you have political leaders who behave like that with public money, the fiscal discipline you're asking about will not happen. Those
Yeah.
types of people cannot build the type of dam that the Ethiopians have built. Now, the problem is that people are going to look across to Ethiopia because, by the way, one of the things Ethiopia is saying is we can sell you power now, and we are on their grid in Uganda, so they can sell us. So Ethiopia, people can say, but wait a minute, if the Ethiopians can do that with money from their own people, why are you taking taxes from us and you're not paying? There, at the store, whether you believe it or not, you may be too cynical to believe this, but there will be a rebellion. It may not be organized, it may not be one that removes the existing government, but the population will not simply accept this kind of thing. I kid you not. So I think that us guys who get involved in public debate, me and you guys, we actually need to put this issue now center of the public discussions and help the African population understand that it is possible for your money to be put to a greater social good that can develop the country. Ethiopia has demonstrated it. We can do this. Why is it that Ethiopia is the only one that runs a viable airline? The rest of us are having to fund these airlines because of corrupt tendencies by the establishment diverting aircrafts, employing their relatives who have no clue what they're doing in the airline. So these are things that the greatest contribution we talking heads can make is to keep this subject front and center of public
Bob,
discourse. We should,
you're right, but I think what I see happening is that we'll have a two or even a three-track Africa. That
okay.
you might see a group, not you might see, you will see a group of
Yes.
countries that actually then take that Ethiopian path.
Mm,
You'll see the holdout who will
mm,
uh, who will uh, who will uh, who will fall behind.
mm.
That because you will see populations. There are certain populations that have been traumatized by corruption and
Yes.
and excesses. There is absolutely no way. I
Hmm.
you know for I don't want to mention, there is nothing some African governments can do to
Yes.
to get people to accept
Yes.
to buy infrastructure bonds.
Yeah.
Uh,
True.
they would probably have to pay them a return ahead of time before they can. But they
Yes.
are those that actually will. So then the premium is going to come from good governance, because and then if then the political class see the
Yes.
payoff from good governance, that just not only are the people putting in paying taxes, but they
Mhm.
are willing to fund this kind of things. You take the Uganda National Social Security Fund. It is one
Yes.
of the biggest players in the Kenyan infrastructure bond market.
Exactly.
But
But
so you
but
ask that
Charles,
how many of
Charles, on
those?
that,
There are a
Charles,
couple of institutions like
I
that whom you can
yeah.
structure something where they are able to do the same thing at home, and
Charles,
and
on
and
Yes.
that
and,
Now,
very,
I
and
think
there are many
you
of them in
raised a
other
very
countries.
important point here. You raised a very important point here, which is public trust, right? And actually trusting in the ability of the government to deliver. Because there had to have been trust in the Ethiopian government for them to actually invest in these bonds, right? And as you said, a lot of Africans have been traumatized by corruption. And when we spoke about, because we've spoken about the Gen Z protests in Kenya, but now what we're seeing in Nepal, their own Gen Z protests, which again was first of all fueled by a pushback against Nepo babies and what was seen as unfair treatment and corruption in the country. And then that now led to protests, which then led to a social media ban, and which then led to what we have seen today, where the PM has resigned. And we're seeing, as Bob said, some very disturbing pictures coming out. But I was with young Nigerians yesterday at a birthday party. And someone said, remember when they gave us social media ban, when Buhari came and he banned Twitter and everyone just bought VPN? We didn't even fight him. Everyone and so and it was and we were all laughing, but it comes and that's when you think I'm being pessimistic, it's also because of my experience of these things where you see what happens where it happens where it occurs in another country, and then you compare it to your own country and you see that there is a sense of a defeated spirit. However, I pushed back on this because I'm more optimistic than you think. And I was like, people think protest doesn't matter, but the political class is afraid of protest. They understand more than most how dicey the situation is, how quickly things can change, how people are teetering on the edge. And the issue, because we had a recent issue with a fuel tax, they wanted to put a fuel charge at the pump for everyone who buys petrol. They said they're doing it for the environment, as though we're in England. And there was a huge pushback to this, and now they've retreated. It's the same retreat when we pushed back against the cybercrime levy. So I want to ask now, right? What can these countries do? And I'll ask Bob because you're the optimist here now that Ferial isn't around. What can these countries that have huge perceptions of corruption, what can they do to build public trust so that they can then build towards these type of projects?
they can't. It's just that simple. They can't because because of the very nature of the way the politics of those countries is constructed and the political elite that are invested in that process. and so once you have a tradition and a culture of transactional politics, it's very difficult for you to decide that there is need to do some public good. There has to be an actual revolution where the political establishment that is controlling the state has to be removed physically, and then allow a new type of politics that serves the public to come through. So I don't expect that all of a sudden something will happen in Nigeria and or in Uganda or Kenya, and these guys who are uninterested in transparency suddenly become transparent. No, they will have to be removed, and they will be removed by the process of history. Either they, their hold on power becomes untenable and they implode, or a simply angry population just can't put up with the way life is and they chase them out of town. That is something that you need to look at. But let's go back to your VPN example. And it's, for me, it's a fantastic example at this one. We may dismiss, or we may think that when people work around bad governments, it comes to nothing. I actually think it comes to something. It is that they find spaces where what they're trying to do cannot be stopped. But over time, what they are doing on the periphery at some point becomes the mainstream. So, why did a lot of young people in the urban areas of Uganda wind up in the ghetto? Because that's the only place where they could be unruly or unlawful or do whatever it is they wanted without the state having to treat them as criminals. Well, 20 or so years later, every politician is now visiting the ghetto for validation and legitimacy in Uganda.
and has representatives from the ghetto.
Exactly. So now the ghetto has come to town and is shaping the way politics is done. And I was telling Charles that one of the most interesting things was watching the riot police of Uganda trying to control the violence at the NRM, the ruling party's delegates conference.
Hmm.
Why did that happen? Because finally the ghetto way of resolving political contradictions arrived uh, at the center of the politics, which used to be ideological. Charles will tell you, those guys, a delegates conference was always about the future Pan Africanism. This time, there was no pretense. The ghetto boys had arrived and they were staking their claim and they were willing to fight in front of the president. And Charles, it takes me back to an earlier engagement where the traders in Kampala, I think it was last year but one, when they went on strike and refused to work, and they demanded for a meeting with the president, and he came and he started lecturing them about going into manufacturing. They told him off, basically insulted him, and started walking out of his meeting. It had to take his presidential guard to force the guys back into the meeting tent. They got back in and they started talking while he was talking. So I don't know which would have been better, whether for them to leave or for them to stay and refuse to listen to him. So I think that what's for me is most important is for us to watch how do the people respond and why do they respond the way they do, and how will that become a problem for the future. So I think whether it's Gen Z in Kenya or it is your friends in Nigeria who are finding other ways, or I think elsewhere we're having another conversation with Charles, and Charles was saying these children who are going to work in as slave labor in the Middle East, they are going to come back almost the same way the Africans who fought in World War came back and caused the independence. If the fiscal responsibility or obligations or whatever of the African political establishment doesn't work, Charles has said we're likely to end up in a three-tier Africa, most likely, but those who are in the bad tier, it is going to be extremely ugly. Yep.
Hmm. Charles, do you want to add to that?
Uh, n- no, I think that Bob is essentially correct, but one of the things is that where there is dysfunction and there is no resolution, the collapse is not necessarily a bad thing. Crisis is not necessarily a bad thing. That the and if you look at it, if you think of it, Why did Uganda succeed almost spectacularly in the late 80s and 90s? Because there had been virtual collapse, and
Even
so
Mm.
Rwanda
there
after the
were
genocide.
no strong vested interests which could resist reform or co-opt. No one had enough money to buy, the politician. The same thing is that the tragedy of the genocide against the Root in Rwanda meant that for the RPF and people like President Kagame, it bequeathed them a blank slate. So they were able to they basically had a fresh piece of fabric which they could work with. Now, in places like Nigeria, which is one of your problems, is there are old layers, they are old trading families, they are they are Nigeria
The
has
Osagis.
like
Eh?
20 layers of vested interest. So and reform kind of becomes difficult. So in that sense, that there'll be a lot of pain, but collapse is itself not always a bad thing.
So I find this fascinating because the Nigerian political class is different from the elite class. The political elite and the elite are completely different classes.
How
And
so?
it's okay. I'll give now examples. When you
Mm,
look at those who are wealthy outside of politics, the Dangotes who come from the Dantata line of royalty, been rich for generations. And you have a few also, like the Emir of Kano, SLS, Sanusi, Lamido
mm,
Sanusi. You have, let's
mm,
think about some of the richest men, Tony Elumelu,
mm,
Jim Ovia. They are exceedingly wealthy. But you also have what you have in Nigeria is kind of not an oligarchy, but essentially you can't piss off the government in order to stay successful in one way or the other, right?
mm,
And but when you look at our political class, you look at the Senate President Godswill Akpabio,
mm.
from no family name to speak of. You look at Nyesom Wike, who's one of the most powerful men in the country, and he was boasting that his dad was a general manager in a factory or something. Again, coming from the lower tiers of society, a lot of these men who have made it all the way up from the local government all the way to the federal government or state or governors and things like that, they are not necessarily what you'd consider the elite. And
Mm,
so when I talk about Nigeria's low quality elite, sometimes it's because the elite essentially absconded, raised their hands, and said, "We want no parts in politics. Politics is beneath me." And you have post in the because of, and I think it's a lot of the trauma of the military era. But in this post democracy era, a lot of the men who are in positions of power are not members of Nigeria's elite class, give or take. And so the way they are around money, the way they are with corruption is that we have a system where might is right, and the hungriest, angriest people have made it to the top. And in order
mhm.
to stay there, they have also appointed people like them on the lower levels. And so, even if you look at the original class of governors versus this class of governors, the difference in quality is very tangible. You do have a few crossovers, like an El Rufai, right? But for the most part, no, you have no Alfred. What I mean is that he's a member of the elite. He went to essentially what is like the Eton of northern Nigeria, with like
Mm.
Yaradua, like the northern elite.
No,
And I think
it's your use of the word crossover. So you move.
he's a crossover in terms of one being a part of the elite, but also being a part of the political elite. And it's also kind of in the north. You still have more entrenched like a more entrenched class elite royal system where those who make it to the top usually are members of the elite there, but in the south that's not the case at all. The governor of Edo State, I think, scored F9 E9 and whatever, like communication skills in the gutter, and he beat Aswe Igodalo, who is from the elite Igodalo family, like three generations of education, has one of the biggest law firms in Nigeria, and the person who beat him is a senator who can't really communicate, right? And so that's what we're seeing. It's Nigerian politics. I think the classes are different, but that's why I always try and send a warning signal to my fellow brothers and sisters across the continent, because what you're seeing in Uganda sounds like what we saw in Nigeria a couple years ago, right?
Yeah.
Where the touts have taken over, the ghetto boys are in the center, and the president has to deal with them or pay them or maintain, some of their support. What you see in those cases, and I want to ask what you think about this, because what you do is that in order to maintain control, when people get more and more desperate to maintain control, they end up supporting things, whether uh, tacitly or actually supporting things that are bad for the progress of the country. We spoke about Bia in Cameroon, but you're speaking about Uganda now. And because we're moving away from this dam issue, but I do want us to go back to Egypt. But how do you see us actually moving forward if the people who are clinging onto power are going to promote and entrench those negative things in our society in order to maintain power?
Just go
Someone would
first.
have said that democracy is the answer, but it's and you've touched on, to me, what I think is really the most important thing is that the thing that has happened with the democracy, we have underestimated the ability of politicians to mobilize, and just that dem- democracy has actually mobilized a lot of popular consent for some of these very predatory practices. So that, as long as the guy is stealing and bringing to my region, I'll support it. And we, apart from everything else, we have a democratic crisis that really some of our worst, practices, and actually have popular support. So I mean, how do you, kind of deal with that? So it goes to this very uncomfortable question. You are talking of solution. Is is this present order that we have, can it stay? Can we, because we have democracies which have failed, but also authoritarian systems which have failed. So the solution has to be just a whole rethinking of where do we find kind of a new path. The other thing,
Mm,
I think that if we could work regionally, there is really a big possibility. So Bob just mentioned that Ethiopia already has uh, built. I mean, they are building lines to, I don't know where. You hear the same things in North Africa. They are building lines all the way to Saudi Arabia and beyond. So I just think that when we get into these kind of broader governance structures, it seems that there is ability to do a little of, a bit of good there. So, and also to gain a bit of kind of advantages which are not possible within the limitations of national markets. So if we can be, just reimagine our politics, but also really push these after things, these the common free trade areas, really get back to making our regional blocks work better. That we have things there that will cause, they can bring a very very radical change in the lives of African people.
So, you see, Adesua, what you described and giving it to us as a warning, knowing what we're going through, with those types of politics, you cannot do what happened in Ethiopia. You can't. It's not possible because, first of all, the reason you can't mobilize money is nobody trusts you with money. So the public is
mm,
not going to invest because when they invested in the electricity company, you renationalized it and you paid them half the money they're entitled to in Uganda. The electricity distribution company that had the contract was denied a contract renewal and paid less than half what they're claiming. So the case is now in London. So once you've sent out that signal, nobody is going to give you money through a bond to go and do other things because they say, no, can't trust you. Which then brings me to something I want to read for you, which is the speech that was given by Pietro Salini, who are the guys who built the dam in Ethiopia. He said no one wanted this country to build this project. No one wanted to finance it. There were many political issues, too many problems, and no easy solutions. But the Ethiopians are not afraid of difficulties. Now, this is a moment for Ethiopians. Guys, these guys have been killing each other for the last, Charles, how many years? Like 3, 4 years. They've been shooting at each other.
No, Ethiopians have killed each other on and off for 300 years.
Exactly. But this one moment has galvanized them. And I think the Egyptians are sitting down and reading this and thinking, what did we just do? And then Charles, one of the guys we know called Kenneth Shaka, has said the Aswan Reservoir is at its maximum. So is the GERD Reservoir. Who would have thought that turbines don't consume water? Now, clearly, the first false narrative about this has been blown out of the water, and the pun is intended. So I think that a reordering of things has just happened. That Egypt cannot push its line in the Horn of Africa the way it thought it would. Ethiopia has made a very powerful statement about its determination and its ability. But for me, the enduring lesson that's coming out of Ethiopia is that a lot of African leaders want to making bluster about, we are our independent, you can't do this to us, but it stops at talk. One country has just demonstrated that it can put its money where its mouth is. It has actually stood up and done something. Now, that is a template for other African countries. If you really want to stand up to an unfair international order, you must do things that the people who you rule can say safely, yes, this guy is acting in our best interests. Ethiopia is showing us how you mobilize national support against an external enemy. Now, interestingly, I suspect that part of this, our president doesn't travel very much nowadays. As long as the flight is more than an hour and a half, he doesn't move. But he went to Egypt 2 weeks ago. And I suspect part of the reason he went was to prepare the Egyptians and sort of deal with some of the issues because clearly the Ethiopians were determined. And one of the messages that is being quoted as having given to Al Sisi is that the Egyptian demands and the Egyptian solution will not work. You have to accept that the countries along the Nile have their own development needs, and we cannot continue with the subordination of the development needs of these countries that was created by the colonial administration. The Ugandans in 1900, when the agreement was signed, are not the Ugandans today. You cannot make the same demands as you made during the Ottoman Empire that the Nile be managed in a certain way. So I think that he went there in part to sort of impress it to the Egyptians that look, and I think he was the more acceptable face of this negotiation to say, look, don't oppose this. Clearly, there is a working formula, and I think this might accelerate, especially since the Middle East is going up in flames. This might accelerate a resolution of the Egyptian relationship. And I think, Charles, I even dare say, Adesua, that it could actually accelerate the resolution of the conflict in the Sudan. But for me, the Sudan shows you that if you continue with abuse and politics of patronage, there will be a collapse. And I think what we saw in the Sudan is a very violent end to a certain establishment. So hopefully something new will come out. Guys, I've got to go now because I must go back to my meeting. So can we see what happened well for us?
Okie dokie. Who wants to start their parting shot? Bob, do you want to do your parting shot?
I think again, my parting shot. I don't know if I said it last week, but I want to say it this week that my parting shot comes from the women athletes. This year, the women athletes have just dominated the international stage, and it was such a joy to watch Shifan Hasefa. No, I'm mixing things up. Shifan Hassan. The other one is Tigist Hasefa in London. Then watching Sifan Hassan dominate and win the first Australian uh,
Oh yes.
major. It was in absolute style. So that for me was that I was like, yes, you've got to believe. But the most interesting quote came from Eliud Kipchoge. They said, why? He said, why are you people asking me to retire? Retire from what? I still enjoy running. I'm going to run. And actually, the guy has a point. He's the fastest 40-year-old man in the world. Why are people who have never gotten off their couches to run 5 kilometers telling him to drop? Yeah. I think Africans are teaching the world something, not just the dam, but also we continue to do a good job in athletics.
Hmm.
In
Well,
fact, talking of dams, in fact, one of my parting shots came, in fact, just when as Ethiopia was unveiling, the Grand Renaissance Dam, Mozambique announced it was building Southern Africa's largest dam, 6 billion, biggest dam in 50 years. And so maybe the so and Bob, your prayers have been answered. Maybe people are learning. But my my parting shot and really my favorite event came from Adesua's backyard. There was this group of three men, and I think a woman who read Express 79 books for 431 hours, and they were reading the books aloud because they wanted to break the Guinness World Record, and so but I mean that was a feat in itself. But I think that the subscript there is that all the 79 books they read were written by Nigerian authors. Wonderful,
hmm.
Bob.
Good.
If you had to read 79
Ugandan authors.
books by Ugandan authors, which were and you removed the the scholarly title, I don't think you would make it, would you?
I passed that one. Guys, I've got to run now. The guys are calling me
Okay,
upstairs.
my parting shot was going to be Senator Natasha
Bob, wait,
Akpoti-Uduaghan.
wait, wait.
Go on.
Yes, I do, sir.
Senator Natasha Akpoti-Uduaghan has finished her 6 month suspension, and she wrote a letter saying, "Suspension is finished from 6th of March, 6th of September. I'm coming back to work." And they were like, "No, no, no, you're not." Yeah. They were like, in fact, you are not. We have appealed the ruling that said your suspension was unconstitutional, so you can't come back to work because it's sub judice. Now, it's absurd, it is insane, but I would just say we have Senator Natasha fighting to be a senator in Nigeria, and we also now have Simone Gbagbo, Laurent Gbagbo's ex-wife running to be president of Cote d'Ivoire,
She's
running against.
76.
She's younger than Ouattara, who's 83.
And you want to build dams in Africa. A 83-year-old can't build a dam. See you guys, man. I gotta go.
Okay.
Right.
Wonderful,
Bye.
Adesuwa. Have a great week, and catch up next week.
Yes, bye guys.